Good evening, everyone. I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to Reading, Latin America and the Caribbean 5th Anniversary Lecture. I'm Sharon Elston. I'm an Associate Professor in Latin American Cultural Studies, and I'm also the co-chair of LAC alongside my colleague here, Claudia Murray. Alongside my colleagues on the LAC committee, I am delighted to welcome you to the special lecture by Monica Feria-Tinta, chaired by Professor David Bilchitz, to celebrate LAC's 5-year anniversary. And we are very grateful to the University of Reading and the Society for Latin American Studies for generously funding this event. I'm going to briefly explain a bit about the genesis of LAC and this event today before handing over to Professor Bilchitz, who will introduce our keynote speaker today. So LAC was formed in 2021 with the aim of raising the profile of Latin American and the Caribbean research taking place at the University of Reading. We aim to provide a uniquely interdisciplinary environment for the expansion of this regional focus within our university and beyond. We came together, a group of academics, because we were inspired and because we knew of the significant work being done on Latin America and the Caribbean at the university. In our initial research, when we set up the network, we identified around 500 outputs in the previous 5 years related to Latin America and the Caribbean. But much of that research hadn't really been given the kind of profile under kind of Latin American studies because Reading didn't have a space for the sharing of this research. We didn't have a centre for Latin American studies, and we didn't have a network bringing together colleagues across different departments. When we came together, we brought together 60 members across 15 different departments. And one of our key aspects, I think the key kind of selling point of LAC on a national level has been the fact that we bring together colleagues in the humanities and social sciences with scholars across the sciences, and particularly in the university's world-leading strengths in meteorology and climate science. So much kind of Latin American studies is focused on the humanities and social science, but in LAC we've managed to bring together kind of cross and interdisciplinary research across the humanities, social science and science. And through that research, we've done a series of events, building our internal network, supporting grant applications, supporting PhD students, and also engaging with external partners, so NGOs, ambassadors, important institutions, scholarly organisations to promote the work that LAC is doing and the research at the University of Reading. So today's event is a celebration. It's also a culmination of half a decade of work promoting this research and fostering innovative conversations across the institution. So we're really proud of the breadth of research on Latin America and the Caribbean developed across the region by our community, and we really welcome other colleagues, both internal and external partners, to also continue to become involved with the network as we continue to amplify this research at the University of Reading. So I'm very pleased to now introduce Professor David Bilchitz, who will be introducing our keynote speaker, Monica, today. So Professor Bilchitz is a Professor of Fundamental Rights and Constitutional Law at the University of Johannesburg and Director of the South African Institute for Advanced Constitutional Public Human Rights and International Law. He is also a Professor of Law at the University of Reading. He was appointed as an acting Justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa from February to May 2024, the first full-time academic to have been appointed directly to act as a judge in the court in over 20 years. He has multiple publications, including 2 monographs, 5 accredited books, and numerous journal articles. He has 2 key connections to the event tonight. He recently co-edited the first book comparing Colombia and South Africa in relation to questions of transitional justice, distributive justice, and transformative constitutionalism. And this book was published in 2023. He also has a connection with the subject matter of tonight's lecture. In relation to the rights of those who are not human, Professor Bilchitz has written several seminal articles that consider the possibility that South Africa's new constitution provides for a change in the status and legal entitlements of animals. He has also considered the relationship between environmental rights and the rights of animals. He has put his ideas into practice as the Director of Animal Law Reform South Africa, and he has played a role in the moratorium on elephant culling and has been involved actively in trying to change the plight of animals in South Africa through parliamentary submissions and litigation. So I welcome Professor Bilchitz up to the stage now.
Many thanks for that introduction. Good evening, everyone. Buenas noches, bienvenidos, and many thanks for the opportunity to chair this event, which I regard as a great honor, this wonderful 5th anniversary lecture of the Reading Latin American and Caribbean Network. It was wonderful to learn how strong that this network is and that it's in fact growing. And this lecture is indeed a testament to the international footprint of this university. Personally, as was mentioned, I have a strong connection with Latin America and particularly Colombia. Indeed, one of the highlights of my life was the invitation I received from key negotiators to attend the signing of the peace agreement between the government of Colombia and the FARC in 2016. As was mentioned, this led to a long-standing collaboration with the Universidad Externado de Colombia and the publication of the book that was mentioned, comparing Colombia and South Africa in relation to those three areas. I've also helped working towards the hosting of the World Congress of Constitutional Law in Colombia this year, for those people who are interested in that area, that it will be a wonderful event, and also worked with the government of Ecuador towards a treaty on business and human rights. As was mentioned, I also feel a deep connection to the subject of tonight's lecture concerning the rights of nature. This notion has entered into the discourse of world constitutional law from Latin America. And indeed, Ecuador was the first constitution to recognize that the Pachamama, or Mother Earth, has legal rights. Since then, there has been a massive expansion of discussions around this topic and various concrete legal effects, with which I'm sure our guest speaker is going to familiarize us tonight. One of my own research areas has been mentioned, has been examining the extension of rights to non-human animals, and there are interesting similarities and differences with the notion of extending rights to nature as well. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce our illustrious keynote speaker, Monica Feria-Tinta. Monica is an award-winning barrister practicing from 20 Essex, and she is the author of the critically acclaimed book, A Barrister for the Earth, which is on sale outside. Some of you will have already seen it or bought your copies, and it will be on sale afterwards as well. This book is referred to as a vital book for our times and radically rethinking our way of inhabiting the earth. And it was shortlisted for the Westminster Book Awards. Monica has acted in a range of seminal cases, including the seminal rights of nature case Los Cedros, a world precedent on egocentric approaches to nature protection, and pioneered climate justice in international courts, acting across landmark international climate cases globally. Her work has contributed to systemic changes addressing climate change and the protection of the natural world. Monica was a Barrister of the Year finalist at the Lawyer Awards of 2025 and the Times First Lawyer of the Week in 2025. She has been referred to as one of Britain's dazzling legal minds, and her work has been featured in the Times, Guardian, and a range of other publications, notable including also interviews on the BBC Radio 3 and 4. Monica became the first Latin American lawyer to be called to the bar of England and Wales in 2014. She holds an LLM from the LAC and was the first Peruvian-born lawyer to be awarded the diploma from the Hague Academy of International Law. It is really wonderful to have Monica at the University of Reading, and I will shortly hand over to Monica to give the address, except just to note that please listen to the presentation carefully, note your questions, and we'll have an opportunity to engage with her at the end with a range of different questions. So without further ado, Monica, I hand the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me today with you. It is really an honor to be speaking here with a particular connection to Latin America, I think. Now, my speech today was going to focus particularly on Latin America's contribution to radically rethinking the notion of rights. A key question in the book I wrote is whether our planet can have rights. Now, why did I explore this question? It was guided by the work I have been doing as a barrister. I have encountered a number of environmental issues, and with these issues, perspectives that opened myself to wonder whether our laws, in the way they are laid out, are reflecting the correct perspective. Our laws, of course, are anthropocentric. And I don't know how many of you may have been aware of that, but I will explain a little bit in what way I realize about that. But this is the fundamental question that I encounter. Now, I want to explain the following before I move on. And this is that I have indigenous background. So I was born in Peru, and my family comes from the countryside, from the Andean world. So this is a heritage and a vision of the world that is deeply embedded within me. Although I moved quite early, rather my family, my parents moved quite early to Lima, the capital of Peru, and I grew up speaking Spanish, not speaking Quechua. Yet it would appear that because of my background, when my clients spoke about the earth in a way that was completely different to the manner how I had studied law, it became familiar very easily. And to me, it made a lot of sense. And I will share some of those stories. So what you can see there, it was an inspirational moment. I was engaged to act as an amicus curiae in a case that concerned Mexico, and in particular, the Macehual people who lived in the area around Puebla. Now, for the Macehual, the world was already broken in the past, and the mountains were the pillars that used to connect heaven and earth. In the midst of that brokenness, they go to high mountains and to caves to present the respects to those divinities and spirits that really are behind all the life forces on earth. Now, what was the case about? It was a case that concerned who owned the land and who owned the soil. It was about a federal law that had to be interpreted in a context where the government wanted to make concessions for oil exploration on land that belonged to the Macehual people. And obviously, in many of the constitutions in Latin America, there is this particular provision that states that the underground belongs to the state, so it could be granted as a concession for this type of explorations. And there was this big discussion as to whether that was the correct interpretation. Obviously, I disagree with that very narrow interpretation. In Latin America, indigenous peoples' laws have developed exponentially because of the work of the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. We don't have that anywhere else in another system. A court that has adjudicated numerous cases where it has established very clearly what are the rights of indigenous peoples. So in a way, international law vindicated the rights of the Macehual. But in the midst of working in that amicus curiae, the key question was, a confrontation somehow of my own understanding, because for them, human beings couldn't own anything. We were just here for a while. We were just guardians of the earth, guardians of the soil. And even producing agricultural products was just a task that could be possible because the spirits of the earth help you. Los compadritos, as they called, that made it possible. So it was not just an endeavor that human beings alone could. And also deities that were extremely important, like the water and the seed. So it's been mentioned before about the Pachamama. Now, Pachamama is a key concept in the Quechua world. And I took this from Wikipedia because I wanted to show you the following. It's been a tendency to think that the Pachamama is really equivalent to Mother Earth, and it could be the Earth itself. No, it's a far bigger concept. And it's a concept that, as you can see, has to do with cosmology. In fact, it's about the whole cosmos. It's where all life comes from. It's not just the Earth and what you are stepping on. It is about the life forces that exist and that, in a way, communicate. There is this division between the underworld, Ukupacha, Kaipacha, and the heavens. And when it comes to the heavens, there is this constant communication. The sun allows for life on Earth, and there is this constant communication of that life force through all these different worlds. And that's so, I would say, specific to the indigenous people's visions. What you consider in Western culture life and death is very separate, as if it were, very separate notions. But in the indigenous world, it's not like that. It's more flowing. That's why the Mexicans are not scared of death, because it's just another way of being. It's a material that is expressing itself in another way, perhaps no longer as a human life, but as another type of life. Now, this is an author I mentioned in the book, and it's an author that, when I lived in Peru, I had no idea existed. He is called Gamaliel Churata. He was a Puno-born author. He expressed, his work is really written in a mixture of Quechua, Aymara, and Spanish. But the vision is fundamentally indigenous. And he's the first author coming from Peru that expressed the world in a pure indigenous way. Not even Jose Maria Arguedas did that. He was the son of a white man, and he was still, and he always said that, Jose Maria Arguedas, his opening the world to the Andean philosophy and way of life is still permeated by his own education. But Gamaliel Churata is an author of a different type. And among some of the concepts that I came across in his book is about the seed itself and the notion of a Hayu Watan, which is the vital soul that ties living beings to life transformational cycles. Now, for me, that was a very important awareness, because I could understand better why my clients, indigenous peoples in different contexts and places, would talk about this link to the land, this link to where they live, to the ancestors, and to understand, for example, why in the Quechua world our ancestors were in the mountains, the Apus, those that came before, and why we had this deep connection to the earth. And it's something that connects not only to the earth, understood as what we are standing, but really to the universe itself, to the cosmic forces. And in that context, human beings are not higher in the Aristotelian notion of hierarchy and human beings on top, but just part of that spectrum of life forces. So we are not at all superior to any other force, we are part of it. Now, I pause here to ask the question, what is development? Because in the midst of my work, I came across challenges to all our notions of, society advancing economically and what that meant. So a lot of cultures, indigenous cultures in Latin America, do not have a word in their native languages for this term, development. It's a huge challenge to that. And also this made me reflect deeper as to when it comes to ecology, when it comes to the environmental crisis that we are, how do you conceive development? Whether the system as we live it is right when it conceives a never-ending spiral up of more production, more building. So for these native cultures, and for example, in particular, the Mayan Chortí, who I met in Guatemala, they explained to me that in Mayan Chortí, the word development didn't exist. The concept of the native people is buen vivir, to have a good life, which basically is to have uncontaminated water, being able to swim in the rivers and lakes, having fruits and crops and not suffering hunger, and have the closeness of the community, etc. So they call it, it's a concept of good living, which in a way, I think our society right now is deeply missing. In particular in England, for example, I'm thinking of all these crises with rivers and why people are so upset about the fact that you cannot even swim in clean water in this country. And are we calling that development? The first chapter in my book has to do with Colombia. And has to do with Colombia, and Colombia really, I mean, this case made me angry. It made me very angry, because up to that moment as a lawyer, as an environmental barrister, I had acted under the assumption that environmental pollution and all the kind of crises that we were living were anomalies in our system, whether it was the climate crisis or whether it was the biodiversity crisis. This was all an anomaly, an unintended fact. But this case really was about a coal mine, and this is the coal mine, Cerrejón mine, in the middle of the desert, in an area where there is an indigenous group called the Wayuu. Now, I had never in my life come across something more extreme when it came to pollution, because everything was polluted. The air was polluted. The rivers were polluted. They received water on bottles only. And you couldn't access any more rivers there. And there was a lot of evidence of these impacts, and yet the companies continued operating. And the companies that were operating were companies that were incorporated in Europe, in our civilized Europe, in Switzerland, in the UK, and there was one in Australia. So I wanted to understand better what made this possible. At the beginning, I thought it was perhaps that environmental laws were not respected enough in the particular case. But as I follow a little bit more the story, I realized that, in fact, this was, the existence of a mine like this was almost like a premise of our civilized world. Why? Because I was interested on where is this coal going to. I started to become very interested about that. My clients, the Wayuu people, were explaining to me how they have diverted even rivers. So it had gone as far as diverting rivers to be able to mine what was underneath the rivers. And while doing that, the whole topography was changed. And climate change was even, because if you change things, you play God, you start upsetting the harmony, the normality of that place. And what I discovered was that the coal was coming to Europe. I discovered that demand was coming from Europe. And I saw that it was coming to Ireland to being sold from there. And it was going to Germany, and it was going to Turkey, and it was going to everywhere else that it needed to go. And I started to become deeply upset because I had lived in Germany, And I was wondering, and at some point I realized before my desk, has my computer been powered in Germany, you know, with this call, the call from this mine. And that made me, all of a sudden I felt implicated. And I started to understand how interconnected all this extractivism happening in Latin America started being quite connected to the civilized world that I was enjoying here in Europe. And in fact, I realized that it was not an anomaly. Our very life here in the civilized world depends on this type of hellholes. And that's what I wanted to change. And I wanted to open the eyes of my readers to do the same kind of discoverment that I had made, because we could change that. So I don't know how many of you have read 100 Years of Solitude, but this is a story about rivers being diverted, you know, or playing God. It kind of rang a bell. And in a way, I understood that a lot of things that have been described in Realismo Maravilloso, it's not really about fantasy. It's about unbelievable reality, in a way. Because look at that citation from the general in his labyrinth. There's a character, and that's Bolivar, who is faced with the pollution of the Magdalena River, brought by civilization. And then he's sentenced. The fish will have to learn to walk on land because the waters will end. Now, that seems to be a crazy statement, but actually I have been finding out in my work that it's very real. The pollution in all possible places, and because it's not only in Latin America now, it's in Europe and it's everywhere else, is such that species, you know, and fish may end up having to develop legs if they are going to survive. So, in other words, I was thinking carefully, can we revert, you know, can we change this attitude we have to nature? And can we overturn this destruction? Now, the Mayan Chortí that I talked about earlier had already told me about that precise word and how development didn't exist in Mayan language, and how mineral extraction, selling, having paper money in the bank is not their way of understanding life and what they treasure. More and more, I started to understand the value of having a perspective towards nature that enabled all life. Now, was this only an idea that belonged to indigenous peoples, is the question. Well, as I discovered in my own area, international law, the answer is no. Already in 1982, the World Charter for Nature, which was a General Assembly resolution, was issued. This was voted in the UN. 111 countries voted in favor. The UK voted in favor. And the description of nature there is that mankind is part of nature, and that every form of life is unique and guaranteeing respect, and that nature shall be respected and its essential processes shall not be impaired. All of this was already acknowledged in 1982, when environmental law was just developing. This is an ecocentric approach towards nature. Now, the way I see that and express these ideas in the book is that when human rights law developed, unfortunately, at some point when the standards were set, we unintendedly separated what is human from nature. Human rights law standards developed in a context of deep crisis, when human life was attacked after the Holocaust, and humanity wanted to set clear standards for respect for human life. But when doing so, and if you look at the instruments back then, they separate everything that has to do with the environment from what is human. And that was unfortunate, because from that moment on, human rights developed in one direction and environmental law in another. My experience working on a number of cases today is that courts now are going back to understanding the connection between humans and the environment. And in leading that path, it's been Latin America, because the work that the Inter-American Court has done in that respect has been fundamental. The last advisory opinion on climate change by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights was the only court that made the connection between nature and respect of human rights and said that all states are obliged to protect nature if they are to ensure human rights. Now, this picture is something I came across, and really there's a whole voyage in my book that ends with the sea and with this major case before the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, in which I acted. But I understood as well that when we talk about nature, it is not about just, as I said, the terrestrial surroundings and where we are standing on, but in fact it's about the whole cosmos. Going back to my roots, going back to this concept of Pachamama that I think I didn't understand at the beginning. Because you see, these people here are from Chile. These are tribes that existed, that were nomads, that considered the sea a relative, and that lived in dark skies. And look, because they saw the stars, they considered already back then the stars as deeply connected with us humans. They actually saw the stars as relatives. And this is quite moving, because the science today accepts that we are pretty much stardust. So we are deeply connected to the cosmos. Well, they knew that already, the sectum. And this is how they celebrated that. I found this fascinating, and how aware of these connections were indigenous peoples in Latin America. But it's not that in the West we didn't know that. This author opened my eyes to the fact that the West knew very well about all the facts that I've been referring before. This is Spinoza. It is an author that opened my eyes to the fact that in Europe, already before the Enlightenment, this thinker told us very clearly that everything is interconnected, and that the world itself, the entire world, is just one unit, living organism, and maybe we're just bits of that world, and that there is no hierarchy. He rejected the Aristotelian view that human beings were on top, and an understanding that really the world is about multi-species, and that, as the scientists put it today, every species really is an epic. Von Humboldt also understood that very clearly. And I touch on this because this concept of everything is interconnectedness was very clearly remarked by him. And where did he learn this? He learned that in Ecuador, when he was observing this mountain, and he really realized that life was in constant movement, and that pollen that was in the air was going to become soon after a different form of life. And that's why he realized that alles ist Wechselwirkung was the most important notion in science, at a time where all the scientists were more concerned about classification of species and separation. Humboldt came with this notion of everything is connected. And this is something that he learned in the context of how indigenous peoples related to nature itself. So he, in a way, picked up very clearly in the Andes how life was really deeply connected. Now, this way of thinking when working has helped me tremendously, because for my climate change work, for example, I could understand how what was happening in one side of the world could be affecting the opposite side of the world. But before that, let me say something about legal personhood and nature, because the question that we had posed at the very beginning was whether nature could have rights. And to have rights, you have to stop being seen as an object and to start being seen as a subject of rights. But look, in law, nothing has been static. Law has always been evolving. Women didn't have rights in the past. We only had that very recently. Slaves were treated as objects. Ships in the UK were treated as subjects, could be in court in their own right. So the law has always been, have a lot of plasticity and has moved. Today, we are even speaking whether software can have legal personhood, that is, have rights. This morning, I was reading an article that some AI, almost autonomous systems, could potentially become a person. There was a question to a woman. The woman was in love with this AI model that actually could predict and act to a great extent as an autonomous person and have a conversation and a deep connection to that woman. We are in a world where perhaps we are going to see, as is already happening in the US, in the UK, we may see a level of acceptance that just as corporations, an abstract entity, may have acknowledged rights, maybe other entities as well. And in that context, I ask, and why not nature? Why not natural entities? And so, can any rights, if we were to accept that nature could potentially have rights in our legal systems, could these rights be defended in a court of law? Well, I had experience to see this happening for real. And it is a very important chapter in the book where I talk about Los Cedros in Ecuador. Now, let me first tell you how I slowly was approaching that notion of nature in court. Here you can see the Inuits. In 2005, they tried to reach the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, telling how in the US, everything was melting there where they lived. It was a climate change case. Nobody wanted to hear about that. They thought it was unarguable. They didn't even register the case. They lost. But years later, after having studied those briefs, I took up this case, which is happening in the opposite side of the world, in the Pacific. And these peoples, who are First Nations in Australia, taught me how their sinking islands were so important for them because they couldn't be who they were anywhere else but linked to those islands. Their culture was deeply tied to it. And in order to defend their rights as culturally distinctive people, I had to the extent I could, defend that nature that was disappearing. And this was in front of a human rights organ. So it was the UN Human Rights Committee. And it was the first time that we were trying to argue that the state could be responsible for lack of action, lack of climate action. Australia defended itself by all means, saying that the climate crisis is caused not by one country, but by many, and therefore is not something for courts. However, we won the case, and the story is in the book. But when winning, and I realized that I had really used human rights law to protect to a great degree both the species in the sea that were disappearing and the species in the island that were disappearing. The next step, what happened was that one day it arrived to my desk, a particular case. This time there were no people there. It was the case of Los Cedros. This is a woodland. It's a cloud forest. You can see all the water evaporating up there. It's a constant in this type of forest, and there were no people. So I was trying to find in the file, who is going to be affected if they destroy this? Where is the impact assessment of the people? There were no people. But it happened to be in a country that has a constitution where Article 71 of the said constitution acknowledges rights to nature directly. This is it. Nature, or Pachamama, where life is reproduced and occurs, has the right to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of its life cycles, structure, functions, and evolutionary processes. Very similar to the 1982, right? General Assembly. So there was a General Assembly resolution worldwide. Okay, this was Ecuador's visions. That is very linked to the native visions that we know indigenous peoples in Latin America have always had for centuries. But what was important here, as you can see, is that the concept of life is not just something that human beings enjoy, but it's something that is being accepted, that nature also has that right. So, in this forest, there were species that you couldn't find anywhere else in the world, and they were threatened with this gold mine operation from a Canadian company that had been given a concession because the state thought there was no one to consult on this project. There is also prohibition in the Constitution of extinguishing species. Now, you see how important that is. I don't think that in this legal system we have anything similar when it comes to prohibition of extinction of a species. But there is prohibited. So I realized during that period I was working on this case that I had become a barrister for the earth, that this had been the most important case so far to reach a constitutional court to understand what those terms that I just showed you in Article 71 meant. Because one thing is that you see that in a constitution, but another thing is, how does that work in practice? What does that mean? And here there were a lot of things that were at stake, and we had during the hearing, I don't know, over 50 different scientists presenting evidence. Some of them were only focused on the frogs because that was their specialism, and how the species were endemic. And maybe in a little square of land, there were species that you couldn't find anywhere else in the world. And this is where the penny dropped for me, because I felt, who are we to stop entire species, to disappear that, to wipe it out? Who are we? Well, this legal system appeared to me more advanced than anything I have seen ever, because it was the correct approach to life. In fact, the ecologist here had an entire piece on that, and he called it the case of the century. When it interviewed me, this was just some years ago. I think the decision came in 2022. Now, Latin America has not only had contributed to those concepts via the constitution in Ecuador. Other countries in Latin America may have not had these principles in the constitution, but have been doing important developments in courts. For example, this river, which was very contaminated, came to the attention of a court in Colombia, and the judges decided to accept that the river had rights. And with that, started a whole system of protection of rivers in the Chocó and beyond the Chocó in Colombia. Why am I highlighting this? This was the inspiration for developing a similar approach to the River Ouse in England, in Lewis, because I advised them for over a year. And this is how the legal imagination can actually inspire other systems with the same idea of protection of nature. And this is the River Ouse in Sussex, and today it has become the first river in England to have these rights acknowledged. And it's not the only one. There has been already big strides towards the protection of rivers because precisely of the ecological crisis in which we are currently facing. Now, in Europe, this has gone also to Spain. This is a Mar Menor. This is a client of mine, by the way. I am acting in a case before the European Court of Human Rights, where I am representing Mar Menor as a legal person that has gone to Strasbourg because there was an issue of due process in a case in Spain. But this area has been heavily polluted by agricultural businesses. Agricultural businesses that, interestingly, have been growing and growing and growing because there's a huge demand for these vegetables. And you know where the vegetables are going to? To England, yes, and it's been bought by Tesco and by others. You know, we got to a point where even if you go to the supermarket and going to buy something, you check and then you want to know what is in that supply chain, and you know, are you becoming indirectly implicated in some kind of violation against nature or people. I want to stop here telling you, therefore, that Latin America's legal thinking that comes to a great degree from the visions of indigenous peoples have become a power force worldwide to perhaps shift our paradigm to allow for a new way of living on Earth. There's no way that we can continue living in the way we have been living, because there is an urgent need for putting limits to that, because the Earth is not never-ending able to provide for those absolutely extreme dreams of just extraction and exploiting. So I think that perhaps that's what I wanted to remark, how what used to be a very looked down visions, you know, and cultures, because there's a history of discrimination in Latin America, has become perhaps our greatest hope. And I think that this is what moved me very much in the context of working with all indigenous peoples' knowledge. And I think that we are now benefiting, and hopefully our law will be able to reflect better how we need to protect the earth in a way that is not for gathering something specifically for us. It's not that attitude of just exploiting something. No, we tend to have that attitude in the West. We exploit ourselves. We exploit friendships. We see everything with the lenses of what can that do for me? And indigenous peoples don't think that way. They think about us, and they think about more generous terms when it comes to how they relate to the general world. And so I hope that these initial thoughts can open up a discussion with all of you. Thank you so much for your attention.
Well, many thanks to Monica for that really excellent, rich, clear presentation, which combines so much of philosophy, of law, of real demand for urgent action in many ways, and a clarion call to see how we can get beyond our current destructive forces and find some way to live in more harmony with the earth itself. So without further ado, I've got lots of questions, but I don't want to dominate. So I would like you to be the ones who ask the questions. I would like to see, and we'll take maybe just to maximize the opportunities, maybe two, let's say, at a time. Okay, would you like to go first? Oh yes, we have to move the mic around.
Okay.
Hi, is it working? Yes. Good. Thank you so much for your presentation and also your work. I feel a bit in awe of what you're doing. I have a question though around where you think this is heading in the UK. So I know Josh Levine, and I work in the Rights of Nature Network in the UK. And I guess for me the question is, do you think that this charters and river guardians will have any enforcement power, or, you know, if councils adopt charters, you know, where do you think this is going to head in the legal sense quite interested in finding out. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. You go ahead.
Whilst you think about your questions, let me answer that. Yeah, how do I do that?
Just hold up the
Yeah?
microphone.
Is it, I thought it was a separate, just this one.
Hold up that mic.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes? Is there a mic there? Yeah. Yeah, that's a very important question. You see, the first thing I have realized is that, you see, I was quite humble when I advised Louis. I thought this is great, but I was quite surprised when after that experience, we had a cascade of other councils that wanted to do the same. And at present, I'm advising, for example, Hampshire. They went beyond the experience in Lewis because they acknowledged in the motion to explore rights for all the rivers in that jurisdiction. And their rivers are special because they are chalk streams. And chalk streams, we know, are so unique, and they are really heritage in this country. But there is no acknowledgement of that. So we've been working, and just last week, a MP tabled a law that acknowledges, well, that wants to get the government to designate chalk streams as UNESCO World Heritage. This is advice that I gave in November, and it was magic for me to see how this was taken up by politicians. If it's not being adopted, you know, on this round, certainly the thought is already there. And I think what we are living right now is a moment of new, perhaps, you know, a desire to have a new social contract in England. You know, at the constitutional level, people are giving nature a special place that didn't happen before and is now ongoing. So what I'm seeing is that the more jurisdictions, the more communities that take this up to their councillors and they want these declarations, we are going to get to a point where just, you know, a parliament has to legislate on this because it's just everywhere. And so I believe that there is that capacity for change. Now, at the most, perhaps not legalistic level, but at the most intimate level, what I'm seeing is a rekindling of a relationship of English people with their own patch. You know, the tradition here is luminous. I mean, I was just been reading about Gilbert White's diaries and how the very notion of ecology started in this country. By that I mean not studying a species in a laboratory, but looking at them, observing them, enjoying them in nature as he did. Well, that tradition comes from England, and it was forgotten because people, you know, were oblivious. But now the ordinary person, the young person, everyone is developing an interest. And I think that is the most important revolution that is happening. You know, that desire of protection is coming from knowledge and people wanting to be connected. And I see a lot of hope. I have hope because I am observing that.
Can I push you a little bit on that in terms of, on the one hand, you're saying that there is a sort of desire for this sort of shift. On the other hand, like, for example, the cause of the major pollution in the rivers, as I understand it, is animal agriculture. It's basically these massive factory farms which are unregulated, and they release basically pollutant, basically feces, etc., into the rivers and pollute. That means people are themselves, the reason those exist is because people themselves desire to eat large amounts and quantities of meat, and at the same time they want clean rivers. And isn't there some kind of problem in that we can't have it all, and that we somehow need to shift the way we approach things, perhaps our own habits, our own attitudes, if we are actually going to be able to live in harmony with the earth?
Well, what is interesting, and you are, for example, referring to the experience of the River Wye, is that the poultry units, so the meat, the chicken, were not just for consumption of the UK. This was for export. So it is really all about making money. So it's not about what people are consuming, although consumption is an important matter. Absolutely, I am with you on that. But I think, we have converted different places because of the globalization, and entities that provide for the entire world. I mean, that chicken that was raised in Wales was being used, exported to the Netherlands and to many other countries, and it was seeking food for those chickens from Brazil, destroying the Amazon for feeding the chicken. So you see the whole model being destructive of nature, precisely because nature is seen just as a commodity and something to extract a profit from. And I think it's in that model where the problem lies. And I think the idea of the book is really to shake you and to tell you this is not the way to live on Earth.
Thank you. I see a question there on the side. Let's go at the back. There's 2 questions. Maybe let's take both of them and then.
Thank you very much. I had a question. Several of us at University of Reading have been working with a philanthropic charity who are interested in transformation to a nature-centric perspective, where we're not, we don't see ourselves as separate from the natural world. But their focus has been on organizational transformation. So, we see things like putting nature on the board of an organization, but it could go well beyond that into terms of transforming organizational culture. And when I asked them why they're not supporting rights of nature, they said because they see the polycrisis is so severe that they don't think governments will be in a position to be able to put new legislation in place that can be effective, and that there's already lots of environmental legislation that isn't being effectively adhered to. So the value of adding more in the, say, the UK context, for example, is limited. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that, and whether you think that's a good argument, and if not, it'd be lovely to get your thoughts. Thank you.
Would you like to answer directly?
Yeah, I can answer directly. Yes. Well, when I work, I'm a little bit of a loner. I reflect, I look at the law, I come up with solutions and advocate for my clients. To share with you something, when I did the climate cases, everybody said it's not possible. And I was in a room in Poland, where it was COP28, I think, where everything was going wrong in COP. And we had this meeting with lots of NGOs. Literally every single NGO doing something on environment was in that room. And I spoke about this possible case on climate against Australia. There was no one single person in that room that wanted that case to be filed. I filed it because my client wanted that. And because I believed, upon having given advice, that it was a sound case, very likely to succeed. That was my own understanding of the law. I understood, that people were not prepared for that, didn't enter into their brains. I succeeded. We won. After we did that case, even after we filed the case, everybody started doing climate cases internationally. So sometimes you need, to have confidence in arguments and push as far as it's possible new ways of thinking to bring innovation. Because people are scared and sometimes people doubt, but that's normal. I act within my expertise, and when I think that within my expertise something is arguable, I go along with that. When it comes to rights of nature, I disagree with that position. I think obviously every single way of advancing a protection of biodiversity is good. But when it comes to rights of nature, we saw what happened in Spain. That's the first country in Europe that has done that. And it didn't happen out of magic. It happened because a community was clear that they wanted to protect Mar Menor. So there's a will there. And I think that it's viable that we may have one day, a statute for the rights of rivers, and we may acknowledge the rights of rivers in this country. Why not? I just put that piece of news there. where software may end up having rights in this country very soon. Explain to me why not a river. Look at what is going on right now with these data centers. And it's already fighting for water in this country. If our rivers don't have rights, in no time, companies are going just to use water in unsustainable manner to advance, the whole tech revolution at the expenses of life. So there has to be a balance. And I would say the balance is to give rights to nature.
Thanks very much. Perhaps following up just sort of some of the legal complexities maybe about a right of nature. Like a right usually in law is understood to be following on from an interest that someone has. So we, let's say, have an interest in being autonomy and be able to speak freely. Therefore, we have a right to free speech. How do we capture the interests of a river? And that's one of the difficulties that we have. So, for example, I live near the River Thames. The River Thames every year sort of breaks its banks and floods. Do we say, well, we should keep the River Thames within its banks and sort of build ever bigger sort of banks, etc.? Or how do we determine whether it's good or bad for a river to flood, for instance?
Well, I think that you see, if you look at how the law has evolved, look at babies, look at children. Okay, at some point, children were not subjects of the law at all. But you see, a child, a baby, cannot talk, can it? But certainly you will know what is in the best interest of that child. And who talks for the baby? I mean, all what we know already about human beings and early development, so doctors and scientists. And so that's the voice of the child at the end of the day, and the parents, obviously, the guardians. So it's the same concept, but apply that to a natural body. When we were defending Los Cedros didn't have a voice directly. But who spoke for Los Cedros in that hearing I told you about? All the scientists. And me was like the director of an orchestra. That's more or less how I saw myself. Because I gather all this different knowledge of the scientists and put them all together in one single submission with the legal analysis that told the court this is to protect, this is what it means in this context to protect this forest. So I think we are very capable because of our scientific developments of what is important for example, keeping the life of the river. Look, the why is a good example. It was clear that too much of these pesticides that went into the water ended up causing an atrophy, just like we have seen in the case of Mar Menor, from agricultural products or others. So science can tell very well what is killing the river. The big question there was, who killed the river? So the scientific knowledge can give us the answer, and we can stop that. I have been able, in the Lewis case, to explore what was going wrong with that river. I'm right now advising the Severn, and it was clear that some of the fish, for example, fish that you don't find anywhere else, have obstacles to be able to spawn. So some rivers in this country give birth to the salmon, the Atlantic salmon, as the birthplace of the Atlantic salmon. And there's obstacles for that fish to be able to get to where it has to spawn. So it's very clear that if you remove those obstacles, or if you aid that fish, it's going to survive as a species. So I would say that science is the greatest aider, to understand what is in the best interest of a river, for example, or a natural body.
Thank you very much. I know we have a question over there.
Hello, thank you. Really interesting talk. I've got a question about influencing businesses, because my perspective is that businesses hold a lot of power for change, and that many businesses, not all, are driven by financial gain, by profits for themselves or for shareholders. So what are your thoughts about ways to make this a compelling case for change, and arguments and ways of influencing businesses? Well, certainly businesses are part of the whole equation. I mean, a lot of
a lot of my time goes into advising different businesses. I mean, I have advised banks, I have advised, all kind of corporations, and I think that it's unescapable. I mean, if you just put profit as the driver, as in the case of, I put the example of this mine, which was extreme. You move rivers to just get more profit. It's a godless world. We are just going to destroy the earth very fast. And by that, I really mean fast, in our lifespan. So here, I think states have a very crucial role. And all these courts that have delivered advisory opinions have already been, clear that the states have a duty to regulate private businesses. And I think that is the next type of generation of cases that we are going to see more and more, both in terms of how they affect the climate, as how they affect nature more widely. So I think that I think I'm going to be very busy in the next decade, basically. Yeah, but I think this is a crucial area, responsibility and awareness, and how a lot of businesses may end up in court, in other words, if they don't consider this seriously.
An interesting issue here is that businesses are often regarded as not being the subjects of obligation in international law. It's only the states that are the subjects of obligation. I disagree with that view, but it is one of the obstacles to achieving greater essentially greater obligations for businesses in some way.
But this is also a very good case for, corporations are legal persons, so have rights. So it's interesting because this is why the case for nature is very strong. It should also have rights, so that you can have more balance in the whole spectrum of actors, so to say. And this is why I'm so excited about the Mar Menor case, because in Europe, corporations can go to Strasbourg because they are persons within the meaning of the European Convention on Human Rights. So a corporation could go to Strasbourg and have the rights upheld, but a contaminated, lagoon where all the fish were coming to the shore dead, it can't. But now it can, so that's exciting.
Absolutely. I see a question over here.
Thank you. I'm really interested in how, when you advocate for nature, how you deal with people's claim to the nature. So like the example you gave of the people who lived on the island, and there was an argument that they could only be themselves on those islands. I can see a world where an argument like that could be made by people to exclude other people from coming to their land, or they make a claim about this is my land and no one else's land. And then that's also just property law, isn't it, that you own a certain amount of land and that's your land. So how, say I wanted to do something in my garden, whose rights would come first then? Would it be mine as a property owner or the land as the land? And I'm just wondering how you navigate those.
Well, the example that I gave was of indigenous peoples. There's a particular regime when it comes to indigenous peoples. It's not about property. It's about a spiritual connection with ancestral land, where your very concept of culture is tied to that. And you can only practice certain ways of certain cultural practices in that particular place. Like you saw these people that live in dark skies, so that's a particular connection with the skies. Put them in a city with lights. You think they can practice the same? No, they can't. They lose that connection with their surroundings. But look, I want to move away from property and focus on relation. And I would say that what I have discovered is the relation that people have at a more human level, simply, not even because you've been, in a territory as part of your ancestral land, but it's just a straight relationship, with a tree. You see, there was been, I don't know whether you've been aware, all these debates around trees being cut down and people grieving, people suffering when seeing this. Where is that coming from? And as a lawyer, I was interested in understanding, do we have a right to green as human beings, whether there is something within our very biological being that requires that connection. I would argue that yes. And it's because we evolved as a species. I've learned that from the biologists. We evolved as a species surrounded by trees. People in deprived areas where there is almost no, how do you call this? Where there's very little trees and no, is the top of the trees.
Canopy.
Canopy. The canopy is very, very scarce. People are depressed. And if you compare, people in areas that are green, I live in a green area. So I could see, when I went for my clients all the way to Essex, in a coastal town where they were fighting for the life of one single tree, I realized that what was at stake was a deep connection with that only tree that still gave you happiness. So I think that's why I was inviting you to see how this separation of what is human from nature has been very wrong, because we do need that green and this connection with the sea, because we evolved within these systems, these ecosystems, and we need that to feel human. I'll leave you with one last thought on that. I worked with people in solitary confinement, so political prisoners in solitary confinement for months, so people that didn't see the light and they were in their cells for months, where it was forbidden to have any green, any plants in their cells, and people went mad. And the scene of someone growing a bean in water, to see that growing, could bring tears in that person, because this is how deep our connection, this desperation to see something growing. So in other words, this goes well beyond any property issues. This is about a connection that we need to understand better when we even interpret our own laws, civil laws, human rights laws, and everything.
Thank you. I see two more. I think I know you've been waiting for a while. Yes.
Should we take the last couple of questions, because we need to wrap up?
Okay,
should take a few around
I think
and then.
there's a lady over here in the third row.
Yep.
Yes.
And then, if we can take them all, and then we'll.
Do I take both? My question is, how can we as citizens support the movement of the rights of nature? How can we support the movement?
Okay, so let's hear.
Sorry, do you want both questions together? Yeah, sorry. I was really interested to hear you describing the rights of nature, but thinking about rivers, because we do have, in the UK, many of those rivers, or parts of the rivers, are defined as special scientific areas, and so there is some kind of designation there already, and we set concentrations around pollutants. So is it really a question of defining rights, or actually prosecuting those rights and finding the polluter? Because you gave the example of the dairy industry, but often it can be many different polluters within a river catchment, and it's actually finding the for want of a better expression, the target to aim for it. Because often an accusation levelled at the Environment Agency is that they just don't prosecute enough. So those rights exist, but it's getting beyond that and actually prosecuting it, basically.
No, I don't think it's just a matter of enforcement, of a matter of, and if they were to be enforced well, then we wouldn't need, no, it's a matter of how you look at it. We conceive nature as something expendable and something to make money of. And that's why, if you are very ambitious, then you don't have limits. You go as far as you have to go. And there are environmental laws, but then you also bypass them, because, there is no understanding that this is highly valuable entity. And so it's a matter of perspective. I mean, would you abuse, a dear relative? You wouldn't. You care. your daughter, you know, your wife, your mother. Well, for the indigenous peoples, mountains are the same. I've seen glaciers in Chile that are black because a company is polluting it, you know, actually puts the very operation just on top of pristine. It hurts me because I see that in a different way. What is wrong with us is not seeing that everything has a right to exist and how deeply connected we are with that. So it's not just about enforcement, it's about the idea to start with, because we wouldn't get to the point of enforcement if we actually care well before. I walk every day through a little forest in my neighborhood, and I have seen rubbish being, you know, thrown. That's the complete disrespect for it, for the dignity of that forest. As I have seen red rivers polluted with heavy minerals, you know, that is, you know, I would say an affront to the dignity of that river, beyond, you know, issues of enforcement. So that's how I feel it. So I think that that's what needs to change, so that we are not facing all these crises, you see, where we need to enforce the law to correct that, rather preventive that we see things in the way that we should see them, and this doesn't happen in that way. As to your question, what can we do to connect with this movement? I think that the young generations have a great role to play. I mean, go and connect with what you love the most in your patch. Is it a river? Is it birds, the species? Is it the deers? What is it? Go and connect with that and see what's happening. I mean, by no means I have been a green person, but what opened my eyes was my work. Now when I walk down, you know, this little forest, I speak to the trees. They are my friends. So that connection, you know, rekindle your connections, and you will see that you will immediately pick up what's wrong, and you will be a kind of guardian for those areas that you value, that you want to see in the future, because it means something important for you. And I think understanding the dignity of these natural spaces and entities is very important. They also have dignity. Every species has dignity.
Do we need to wrap up? Yeah, well, Monica, I think, as you can see, many people will want to continue discussing these matters with you, and hopefully there will be an opportunity now over some glass of wine or something like that to do so, and to have an opportunity to actually acquire this wonderful book. Just to say a really big thank you to you for this really diagnosing the problem that we have at the moment in our world with this tremendous environmental destruction, but going beyond that, in a sense, recognizing that it's a kind of philosophical problem, that it's a deeper issue of focusing on ourselves and not seeing ourselves in connection to other things. And that shift in consciousness, I think you've pushed us towards, is so powerful, of an interconnectedness of things and living our life in the way that is interconnected in that way. And so I think that is there's a clarion call both for shifting ourselves and also shifting our behavior and changing the way we relate beyond ourselves. So let us join together and give a round of applause to Monica.